All right. Well, awesome. Thank you all so much for being here on a Monday. Today, we're going to talk about writing compelling proposals and how to tell your story to different types of funders for different types of grants. So before we get into that, I'll just briefly introduce that we are doing this as part of the Tacoma Capacity Building Project. And this overall goal is to provide training and assistance to nonprofit organizations within the city of Tacoma, with a priority focus on strengthening BIPOC organizations, newer organizations, and organizations with youth education programs in the Tacoma community. So this is presented in partnership with the City of Tacoma's Neighborhood and Community Services Department and the Arts and Cultural Vitality Division. So thank you to Tacoma Neighborhood and Community Services and the Capacity Building Project for bringing this together. So as I mentioned, today's theme, we're going to talk about how writing a grant is like telling a story. And my hope today is that we can kind of help to demystify the process of grant writing a little bit, because I think that a lot of times it can seem really overwhelming or intimidating, and you might not be sure exactly what organizations want to hear in order to give you funding. And so we want to talk a little bit about how different types of grants maybe can be compared to different genres of writing, and that maybe this can be a way to help you demystify grant writing a little bit and think about how to make it easier. So we're going to think about kind of three different genres of grant writing. So the first one we're going to compare to a thriller or mystery novel. So those are going to be federal grants, the big ones. And then there's also plays, like perhaps a play in 2 or 3 acts. That's what we're going to compare city, state, or county, like sort of local government grants or state government grants are like multi-act plays. And then there's also the summer beach read of the grant world, which would be, different private foundations or corporate grants, maybe like Walmart or Costco or something like that. So those are the three big categories that we're going to talk about. Before we break it down into each of these categories, I'm first going to talk just a bit generally about how grant writing is like storytelling, and then we'll go into things that are different for each of these genres of grant writing. So I want us to think about the elements of a good book or play. So maybe think about that book that you're reading or would like to read, or just any book you've enjoyed in the past. There's a couple of elements that are common. You think about the setting, the characters, and then the plot or the events. And so I think this is a great way to think about your grant writing too, because sometimes it can seem very vague. The grant application might ask a question such as, why tell us about your organization and why you're qualified to apply for this. And sometimes with a really general question like that, you might be a little uncertain with how to respond. And so I want you to think about, both for those really vague questions and maybe also for more specific questions, think about how you can think about your organization and your work as these elements of writing. So the setting, the characters, and then the plot. So a tip that I'd like to give is to include things even if they seem obvious to you. I see this a lot with folks that I'm working with on grant writing. Perhaps they're applying for a grant that is being given by a local organization. And so, they think, oh, because this organization is nearby, they know about the area, they know about the work that we're doing. And so, folks might not include all of the details in their writing because they assume that, maybe they're obvious or maybe the funder already knows that. But I would encourage you to include all of the things, you know, even if they seem very obvious to you, or even if you think the funder might know them already. Because when your grant application is being reviewed, you know, only the material in your application is what is going to be scored. And so even if the funder knows something about your organization, if they don't read that in your application, it's probably not going to count, you know, towards the points of your application. So I want you to think about, you know, just assume that the grant reviewer doesn't have any knowledge of, you know, your local area, what you do, or the need for your work. And so something that I'm going to stress throughout this presentation is that a grant writing doesn't need to be fancy. It doesn't need to be, you know, big words or fancy writing. The thing that I really want to stress is that the important part is writing that is clear and descriptive. And so there's a little example description here. So of course, if you were writing this for a grant, you would probably expand a lot on this, but I'll just read through this and point out the different elements. So, located on the main street of Maplewood, a small town facing economic challenges, is the Community Learning Center. So there we go. We've got our setting. What is it? It's a small town, and there's a community learning center that is there on the main street. So then the center is run by a team of 4 staff and 15 volunteers. Those are your characters, who provide after-school tutoring and mentorship to at-risk youth ages 10 through 18. Those are also characters in your story, you know, the youth that you are providing the services to. With increasing dropout rates and limited access to educational resources, the center aims to offer a safe space for learning and personal development. So that's your plot. So I think that, you know, kind of thinking about these 3 things might make it easier for you when you're thinking about, you know, what on earth do I write? How do I explain what I'm doing? Think about these things, you know, the setting, the characters, and then the plot. And again, this can be really brief. You know, maybe you are just asked to summarize in a couple of sentences, and you could do something like this. Or, you know, you could make a whole page or more out of the setting and out of the characters and then out of the plot. And that would be a pretty complete description of what your organization is doing. So I hope that that's a helpful way to sort of think about grant writing, maybe from a new point of view. So let's break down these different elements a little bit. So the first element is setting the scene. You know, so think about books that you have enjoyed, or you know, even a TikTok or something like that. You know, there's a scene, there's a setting. You can see where it takes place. So some things that you might want to think about describing would be, you know, what is your city like, or the county that you're located in. Even more local, you know, what is the neighborhood where your organization is working? What is that like? And then, you know, what is the space where your organization is actually operating from? You know, do you have an office? Do you have, you know, what kind of space do you offer, and what kind of space do you do your work from? And again, reiterating what I've been saying here, you know, don't worry about being fancy or wordy. Just really focus on being descriptive and simple and clear. So that's a bit more about the setting. So to help explain the setting that your work is taking place in, using statistics is a great way that you can build up the setting and help set that scene for the reader. So, you know, think about using statistics that are related to the population that you serve. So to kind of play off the little sample description I did in the previous slide. So, you know, perhaps you have an organization that is serving youth. And so you might use a statistic like this. For example, during the Pierce County 2022 Youth Point in Time Count, 332 homeless youth and young adults between the ages of 13 and 24 were counted. Among the youth surveyed, a family crisis or breakup was the most commonly reported cause of homelessness, followed by a lack of affordable housing. And then this goes on to list a few more statistics about this population. So I would highly encourage using statistics like this. This is just from the Pierce County website that I pulled this from, and so just think about your characters and think about your setting, and then think about finding statistics like this that can reinforce those things. And this can be a great way to just really add more detail. Grant reviewers love to see numbers and statistics and details, and so this can be a great thing to do. I just want to make sure I see a hand up. Andrea, did you have a question? Or I'm not sure if maybe your hand was still up from before, but I don't want to ignore you if you do have a question.
I think I failed to put my hand down. I'm sorry about that.
No worries at all. I just wanted to make sure.
It
Yeah,
is down.
if anyone does have a question as we're going along, you're more than welcome to raise your hand, and I'll be happy.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, yes. What's your question, Millie?
For example, in this, you have a percentage of this youth. Where you get it, that data?
So this data came from the 2022 Pierce County point in time homelessness count. So to find this, I just did a Google search. I just searched, I think something like homelessness statistics, youth homelessness statistics in Pierce County. And so, yeah, so things like this should be publicly available, particularly related to homelessness. There's usually the annual point in time counts for every city, maybe also by county or by state. So yeah, so these should be on sort of the government, the county website.
Yeah, and for example, you can find it at 2022, but 2023, they don't have it yet.
That's true. Yeah, this was the most recent that I could find. So yeah, so probably the 2023 has been conducted, but they just haven't finished tallying up or releasing those numbers. Yeah, that's probably pretty common for statistics that they're behind, so yeah, like 2 years behind is probably pretty normal. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question. So going back to our theme of thinking about grant writing as telling a story. So we've talked about the setting. So now let's talk a little bit about describing the characters. So the characters can be, as I mentioned, both you and the other individuals who work at your nonprofit or your organization. And the characters are also the individuals that you are serving. So this is kind of a list of questions that you can think through to describe your characters. I believe that we will send out or make available this PowerPoint presentation afterwards. So if these questions are helpful, don't feel like you have to jot them down. You can access these later. But these are some questions you could think about. How many staff members and volunteers do you have? Who are you and the other key team members that are driving your mission forward? Also, what partnerships and collaborations do you have with other organizations or stakeholders? So that's a big one to think about too. The characters are not just you and the folks that you are serving, but could also be other organizations in the community. What other organizations do you refer people to, or who refer people to you, or who you sort of work in synergy with to provide services to help folks. So those can be characters as well to describe when you're thinking about describing the characters in your grant story. So here's a little example, an example character description. So you might say, our clients are primarily single parent households, recent immigrants, and individuals experiencing homelessness. Many of our clients face barriers such as language differences, with a significant portion speaking Spanish as their first language. So that little blurb would describe, the folks that you are serving. And then also our team consists of 10 full-time staff members and over 50 dedicated volunteers. Staff includes healthcare professionals, social workers, and outreach coordinators. Volunteers help with food distribution, tutoring, and community outreach. So again, this is really brief, and if you were doing an actual grant application, you might expand more on those. But this is, a example of how you might describe all of the characters who are part of your grant story. So the third element, so we've talked about the setting and the characters. So the other element of your story is going to be the plot. And so, you know, if you think about a good story, there is some sort of action, you know, a challenge or an obstacle that has to be overcome. So when you're working on your grants, you know, you want to think about what is the issue that you're facing? You know, this is kind of like why you are requesting grant funding. So there's a bit of an example here. So you might say, you know, our organization is facing a significant challenge in providing after school programs to at-risk youth. The local schools have limited extracurricular activities, leaving many students without a safe and engaging environment after school hours. So that is the challenge, right? So the local schools aren't providing extracurricular support, and then students don't have a place to go after school hours, and so as a result, these youth are becoming at higher risk of falling behind academically or becoming involved in activities such as gang affiliation or substance abuse. So this is the challenge. This is why your nonprofit exists and why you're doing the work that you're doing, to overcome this challenge or this obstacle within the plot line of your story. So now that we have like this brief overview of the setting, the characters, and the plot, so those are going to be consistent, you know, no matter what kind of genre of grant you're writing for. So we can now jump into exploring different genres of grant writing. Before we do that, does anybody have any questions or anything they want to bring up about what we've covered so far? Feel free to shout it out or raise your hand, whatever you'd like.
Sorry, guys, my phone died.
No worries, JT. Glad to have you back. Okay, cool. So let's jump into it and let's explore some different genres of grant writing. So as we've mentioned, federal grants we're kind of comparing to a thriller or a mystery novel because they can feel that way. They can feel a bit like a mystery because they can seem really big and daunting. So I'll give you just kind of a few tips about like some key elements of the federal grants. So, you know, like a thriller or a mystery novel, a federal grant has a complex plot. A lot of times it's going to have really detailed and intricate requirements. You know, you can think about these as like the twists and turns in a thriller novel. And so just like in that thriller novel, one of the things that you want to look for is clues and evidence. You know, so like the detective in the book might be gathering clues. You want to check and double check all of the details. Some things that can be helpful to do, maybe to attend the pre-proposal meetings. Now, pre-proposal meetings may exist for other types of grants. You know, they may also exist for state and city and county grants, but I would say that it's particularly important to maybe attend those meetings for federal grants because they can be so detailed and intricate that, you know, the more support you can get and the more clarity you can get, you know, that can really help because the guidelines can be really strict. And, you know, I think this could even go towards some things that folks have been saying today about, you know, grant writing having sort of a specialized language. I think that comes out the most in federal grants because they are so detailed and can be so complicated. One thing to look for is that sometimes with federal grants, there will be free technical assistance made available. I think this is one of the things that, in the more recent move to try to make grant writing more equitable. And, it's one step out of, I think, many that should be taken. But there is sometimes free technical assistance that's made available as part of a grant application. So that could be a clue that you can look for. Just look for those keywords, free technical assistance, and you might be able to actually connect with somebody with knowledge of that grant who is employed by that agency who's giving out that grant funding, and they can't necessarily usually help you with the writing itself, but they can help you make sure that you understand the requirements and kind of just give general advice about the application process. So that can be a clue in the thriller novel of a federal grant to look for. And yeah, just like a thriller, a federal grant is kind of high stakes. Missing a clue or a requirement could mean the difference between a success and a failure. And so that's why, as daunting as a federal grant may be, if you do choose to go for one, maybe it can make it a little bit more fun if you think of yourself as a detective and kind of put on those glasses of searching for the clues and gathering the clues and double checking all of the details, and just really crossing your T's and dotting your I's. I think that that can be really helpful, because the worst thing is to submit a grant application and then have a little requirement missing, and then that might end up having your grant application not reviewed. So especially with federal grants, just really checking and double checking all of the details and looking to see if there is support that you can get to help you with that. So the state, city, and county grants are perhaps a bit easier. I think it's fun to think about these as a play that might be in a couple of acts. The reason that we're making that comparison, so you can kind of think about, Act One, like the stage. So the nice thing about these grants, like for example, if you have ever applied for a grant from the Washington State Department of Commerce, you might notice that these applications often have a structured format, and it's consistent across most grant applications. Now, like with all grants, you still want to double check and make sure that you are understanding all of the requirements. But, once you have applied for one grant from the city of Tacoma or from the Department of Commerce, you may have a pretty good idea of what the subsequent grants will require. There's usually a certain format. They require a cover letter, 2 or 3 signature forms, and then, a description of the services that you're proposing. So maybe that's a bit encouraging to think about, the more of these kinds of grants you apply for, maybe the easier it gets, because the stage of the grant is kind of consistent, across different ones. With the CAST Act 2, there are also certain roles, you can think of them as actors, such as stakeholders, maybe folks who work at the Department of Commerce or who work at the city of Tacoma. So you may get to know these different actors over time. Typically there's only a few employees that are kind of in charge of managing grants. And so, again, if you apply for one grant from City of Tacoma, you might get to know some folks. And then, that cast might be similar for other grants that you apply for. The script of state or city or county grants might also be predictable and consistent. So kind of going back to Act 1 with the structured format, the way that these grant applications are put together may be consistent. Okay, so let's move on to our final genre. I think this one's the most fun. So we're comparing, foundation or corporate grants to a summer beach read. So these are probably the most enjoyable grants to work on. They may have a little bit more wiggle room and flexibility than the government grants. So yeah, so the elements of a summer beach read, like I just said, engaging and accessible. You might be able to be a little bit more creative. You might be able to add a bit more of a personal touch. a thing that can be really great to include is, stories from folks who have benefited from your programming. And this is a great thing actually to just get in the practice of collecting. If you have participants who have successfully gone through your program or attended some of your events, get in the habit of collecting that feedback. And particularly for foundation grants, this kind of stuff is great to include, but I think that there are also times where you can include this stuff with the other types of grants as well. You might just incorporate it a bit differently. But those personal stories from the people who have benefited from your work are great and are really make an impact, because again, it's similar to having a letter of reference or recommendation from somebody else. It's, you can say everything you want about your work, but to have somebody else say, this absolutely changed my life, that can be really impactful and a way to just add more of a personal touch to your grant application. So yeah, thinking about also, the summer beach read, again, think about these grants as just as a story that you would read, having an introduction. You might kind of capture the attention with a compelling story. Maybe that might be some feedback from some of your participants. You might open with that. Then there would be the middle chapters. You might detail your project, highlight the impact that you've made. And then with the conclusion, wrap up with a strong call to action. What are you hoping to accomplish? What comes next? What can you do as a result of this funding? And provide a clear summary of the benefits of how that funding would impact your organization. And so yeah, and you can maybe be a bit more creative with crafting your story of these elements, with the summer beach read, with the foundation grants. But these are also great things, as I said, to think about with the other types of grants too. Well, amazing. So like I said, I've got a few resources here. Again, I know these links are way too long to write down, but we will be sending this out. I think, can I put these in the chat? No, it won't let me copy paste. But yeah, so these are some resources where you can see some sample grant proposals. These are on a website called Candid. You do have to, I think, create an account, but it is free. So if you just create a free account, if you don't have one already, you can get access to this library of sample grant proposals. They also have some sample budgets in there, some sample letters of inquiry, maybe also some sample cover letters. So I think that this is really a fantastic idea. It's like if you were going to start writing novels, the number one thing you would need to do would be read a lot of novels, so that you can get an understanding of them. And, so if you've got 15 minutes a day or something, read through a grant proposal that was awarded, and that will kind of start getting the things to sink in, so that you can think about and remember these elements of grant writing that work well and stand out.